Hello, friends. Welcome to our weekly Data Talk, a show where we talk with data science leaders from around the world. Today, we're talking with Dr. Chloe Bakalar and Ben Zevenbergen. They're at Princeton, and I was reading some articles by them and was just amazed at the work that they're doing around AI and ethics and the various case studies that they're doing, and super excited to have them on the show today. And before we get started, I want to just kind of do some brief introductions. So maybe Dr. Chloe Bakalar, if you can kind of be sharing a little bit about your background and how you got started working with ethics and AI.
Sure, I'm happy to, and thank you again for inviting us to do this. So my background is in empirical social science and then also political theory and philosophy. I started out life studying politics as a more empirical discipline, and then got interested in philosophy and political theories, especially sort of from a democratic angle and looking at how different communications technologies affected and were affected by democratic ethics. So then you start learning a little bit more about the technologies, you start learning a little bit more about AI as it relates to those, and then a whole world opened up to me at Princeton when I started getting more involved with the Center for Information Technology Policy. So that's sort of where I'm coming at it from.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Chloe. And Ben?
Yeah, I trained as a lawyer in Europe, focusing on information law. So I was learning a lot about the technologies as I was practicing law, and what I saw was that the technology is moving so fast and the law is lagging behind. So I went to work in policy at the EU, and what I noticed there was that it's really hard to actually update the laws. It's not an easy process. And we tried to work with engineers there, but engineers often didn't quite understand the policy procedures or the laws. So when I went to do a PhD at the Oxford Internet Institute, I started exploring ethics as a bridge to talk or to enable discussion between technologists and lawyers and policymakers, because there was this gap of regulation. And then at Princeton, that focus switched to AI technologies, partially because a professor here had been working on that for a long time. And yeah, as Chloe said, a whole world opened for me, because these AI technologies are even further than all the internet technologies I was working on previously, or further away from current laws and regulations. So I really saw the need for ethics analysis to make sense of what actually is good and bad in these technologies and in their design and their governance. And it's only once you start understanding that and being able to articulate that, that you can then go back to lawmaking, in my opinion.
Ben and Chloe, what types of things are you guys considering as AI is developing at a super fast rate, impacting so many different types of people, jobs, how organizations are working with data, and you're looking at the ethical side, and it's super, super important that ethics are being brought in because there are so many different decisions that AI is going to be making, and we want to make sure that AI is being used ethically, making ethical decisions. And sometimes it's very hard when we see situations where we've seen AI be abused, maybe by the training data mistakenly, or even like situations where there was that that Twitter bot that was fed in some over the course of a 24-hour period. All of a sudden, that Twitter bot turned into a racist tweet bot, and you hear stories like that. Just because of the input, right? Because people are sharing input and then the AI learns from that input. And so it can be that AI can turn out to be good, but also it could turn out to be bad based on the type of input that it's given. So I'm kind of curious about, as you're beginning to look at these different technologies and the way AI is used, what types of people or things are you bringing into those conversations to help make help the AI make ethical choices, if that makes sense?
Well, I think you bring up in your question a really important issue, which is that for the most part, AI is just a tool, right?
Yeah.
It's neither inherently good nor is it inherently bad, and it often comes down to the specifics of design and the people who are using it, the people who are feeding it information. And that's one of the perspectives that we try to include in all of our analysis, is not to be talking about AI as this inherently scary thing, but as this thing that reflects our social norms and mores and then reflects back onto it. Ben?
Yeah, I think a thing that I'd like to add to that is the wide range of technologies that fall under this artificial intelligence umbrella. You can't really open a newspaper anymore without a doom scenario article about AI generally, or a great success story. But it's really hard to find out what actually those technologies are doing in those kinds of articles. And it's the same for policy documents or adverts from AI consultancies. And I think it's really important to shed light on how these technologies actually work. And for that, you've got big technical books that can explain that to you. But what we're trying to do is show that these technologies are not, God-given or super complicated, but that they are indeed, developed by people for certain purposes, using certain existing methodologies in computer science or math. And then how you can how to think through applying them to social contexts, and thinking through the technical trade-offs that you have, and all the value tensions that come along with those. So, but I think my point is we're trying to step away from the mystique of AI a bit and get to a real conversation about what these technologies are, how they're designed, and what alternatives are open to people.
On the same note, to the same extent that we're trying to just demystify AI technologies, I think we're also trying to demystify ethics a little bit. We start from the premise that humans are all moral beings who have an intuition about what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. And we're trying to talk to people at that level, not the scary meta-ethics conversations that happen just at universities, but to try and make it something where everyone feels like they have something to add, which we think they do, and everyone feels some sort of responsibility.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love the fact that we're having these AI conversations, that you guys are looking at it from an academic standpoint and also from an ethical standpoint, because so often when these data talks are focused more on the technology side, the data science side, and I think there's a very big need to have ethicists, to have philosophers involved in these conversations, because we're talking about data, how a machine's going to work, how a bot's going to work, and it can impact like us as people. In many situations, like, we need ethicists to be there to help guide, to help with the design process. I was just talking with a friend over the weekend, and I was using this app called Woebot, Woebot, and it's an AI bot that works on kind of emotional care, kind of like a AI therapist is kind of the idea, which is great for, I think the goal is to help people who don't have money, right, to see a therapist, but need some help with maybe some issues. And so this AI bot, which I've been checking out, it's called Woebot again, is kind of a way to kind of check in on a daily basis to say how you're feeling, and it kind of measures your happiness level throughout the week, throughout the months, and it helps you work on different skills. Well, anyway, so over the weekend, this was a couple weeks ago, I was sharing out. My son is like 9, and I was kind of playing around with it, and I said, "Oh, you want to play with it?" And so he started to play with the bot, and I'm not sure what exactly happened, but in the course of a couple minutes, Sam's like, "Dad, can you come look at this?" And I looked at it, and the bot thought that I was suicidal. It thought that I was very depressed, and I was like, "What did you type?" I didn't know what he did. Anyway, so I was at that point. I was like, the bot was basically like, "You need to contact somebody immediately to get help." And so then my question was like, does the Woebot have a responsibility if I was truly suicidal and needed help to then contact a hospital, right, or a police department? Would it have the responsibility to do that, right? That's an ethical decision. And then what if I never gave the rights to that bot to share that information with anybody, right? So there's always like ethical decisions at play with a simple thing like a Woebot, right? That's just one small little example of how, like, what happens to that data, that emotional data that's being collected, and how it could be used to maybe, I mean, in a real situation, it could have been useful to maybe help me, right, in this situation. Had I given it the permission to share it with a local healthcare provider, right? But it's kind of like a microcosm of like this world we're going into where AI, we're interacting with AI more and more, and like does our voice assistant at work, does it have a responsibility to share things that if it notices maybe our mental health is declining or something like that, right? So there's always like really interesting things, and I'm really happy to hear that you guys and bringing in ethicists and other people to help solve some of these issues. I was going through your case studies, and I love reading through them. And for those listening to the podcast, the short URL that redirects over to the AI and ethics section on Princeton's website is just ex.pn/Princeton, and that'll bring you over to the page with all these different case studies. And Ben or Chloe, do you want to share a little bit about some of the case studies you guys have worked on recently?
Well, sure. So we just released 2 new case studies. We have 3 more that are currently in the works, but the newest ones are the hiring by machine case and the public sector data analytics. And so they just follow the same format as the 4 original cases, sort of a narrative of a particular AI technology and the world in which it exists, sort of going back and forth between various actors who influence the development and deployment, and also the ones who experience it both for positive and negative, or both in positive and negative ways. And the idea is really just to challenge readers to think of these technologies in terms of the many different intersecting ethical issues at play. So we list right on the website some of the major issues that we identify and that we grapple with in each case, but we expect that people will find more. And one of, I think, the interesting things about them is that all of these issues come together and affect one another. So it's difficult to pull out, say, fairness, which is a hot topic in AI ethics, but it's difficult to pull that out from the questions of diversity, for example, that those themes really do impact on one another.
Yeah, maybe added to that is the reason we publish them and the way we build them. So we try to publish them to be used in academic courses, but also for professional development workshops, or whoever else may want to learn more about the intersection of this technology and ethics. And it's not written for a specific discipline. So we're not writing specifically for the philosophy faculty or specifically for computer scientists. And we've done a lot of workshops on with these case studies with a very varied group of people from all sorts of backgrounds and interests. Some people who are only interested in technologies, others who have zero technological background. And it seems to work really well to get to the bottom of some of the ethical tensions. And the way we've structured sort of gathering the information for these cases is we set up these workshops at Princeton where we invited computer scientists, philosophers of different philosophical disciplines, ethics, political theory, and also social scientists and sociologists. And at these workshops, engineers who work for companies or government agencies come to Princeton and they discuss a specific ethical dilemma that they've recently had in designing a system or even deploying it to the wider world. And then we analyze the presentation. So they give us their experience and maybe ask a few questions along the way. And then the philosophers, with the support of the computer scientists, try to really get to the bottom of the issues in those cases. And we then take notes and write them up in a de-identified way. So they're not like Harvard's business schools cases where it's about a specific company, but it's, we try to create a narrative that doesn't pinpoint one particular organization.
So there are several cornerstones, I think, of the cases. There's been a lot of discussion in AI ethics circles about whether case studies are the right approach to tackling these issues, and if so, what they should look like. Oh, yeah?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I got cut out a little bit. Can you say that again one more time?
Oh, no problem. I was just saying that in AI ethics circles, there's been a lot of discussion about case studies and whether those are the appropriate way to tackle these kinds of issues, and if so, what those case studies should look like. And so we've sort of implemented several key criteria, as Ben mentioned. We start from empirical observations about the world as told to us through the actors who lived them, but then we anonymize the cases so that we can have a more free and open dialogue about them, and so that companies don't feel like they're about to get attacked out in the media for speaking to us. We write for an interdisciplinary audience, which means that at every step of the way, we get feedback from people from multiple disciplines. So not just philosophy and computer science, but also the social sciences more broadly, and more of a political theory angle as well. We try to capture a robust story that includes lots of different elements and complexity instead of just focusing on one particular area. So these are all things that we've really prioritized in these cases.
And Ben, you mentioned at these events where you're bringing together all these different people to discuss AI and technology that's developing and how it can impact ethics. I'm curious about some of the ethical dilemmas that have been brought up that you guys have kind of workshopped.
I think I'll leave this one for Chloe, who's the actual ethicist here.
Oh yeah, the super hard question.
I'll do the easy one.
Well, so what would you like to know?
Oh, I'm curious about through all these conversations, are there any conversations, ethical dilemmas you guys have discussed that have stand out to you that have been very interesting?
Oh wow.
There's so many.
Yeah.
I guess like you're chatting with your family like about over the holidays, Thanksgiving. They're like, what are you working on? What are some conversations you've had that have been like, oh, this is interesting?
Yeah, Chloe, do you have one in mind, or just like?
I think that's such a difficult question because I feel like I end up talking to my family.
That's so funny.
One of the interesting things is how much, like, regardless of the kind of technology and the kind of industry and the kind of people involved, a couple of themes come up virtually every time. And so I guess that should be a signal to all of us that they're particularly urgent. So questions of legitimacy and accountability pretty much always come up. Questions of transparency pretty much always come up. Individual rights or autonomy, fairness. There's a couple of these really big and unfortunately very difficult ethical issues that come up each time. And I guess that's been sort of interesting to see when you think of AI so broadly construed that it includes, you know, everything from a chatbot to, you know, a company's way of filtering out hiring applications. I mean, that in each of these instances, it seems like there are some core issues that people want to talk about.
Yeah, I think a good example of, it's not necessarily a traditional dilemma, but in one of the new cases that we published, the one hiring by machine, Chloe does a really good job in one paragraph explaining the complications of trying to codify fairness into a system. So you have it's a big discussion, especially in computer science, but also in tangential or in disciplines around it. Is, you know, how do you make these systems fair? But then the question really is, you know, what do you mean by fairness? And fairness can mean a lot of things. But a computer scientist, I'm overgeneralizing here, but oftentimes you'll see a computer scientist looking for a mathematical way to operationalize such a value. You know, if someone says take privacy seriously, then you'll typically see a computer scientist react with encrypting databases rather than not collecting data, which would be a better way of protecting privacy. And it's the same thing with fairness, where you say, you know, make sure the system is fair towards the people on which it's making decisions. But what then does that actually mean for the people on the ground? Chloe can say a lot more about this, but this is also kind of a reaction to one of our colleagues, Arvind Narayanan, who published or is working on a series of papers where he's describing the 21 definitions of fairness that he's found in computer science literature.
Oh, wow.
So that already goes to show that computer scientists could be aware that there are 21 different definitions in their own discipline. But then if you take that to philosophers, they'll say, well, that's great, but we have thousands of definitions of fairness. So I think that's a real big dilemma. And how do you even communicate to the person who's building a program that's going to have an impact on people's lives, what it actually is that he or she should be, or they should be optimizing for, and what does it actually mean? So what I've usually seen when people talk about fairness is what they program is non-discrimination. So they're trying not to discriminate on certain proxies, be it race or gender or whatever else, or certain variables, I should say. But you know, there's a lot more to this age-old concept than just a line of code saying, let's ignore this particular variable. So that's a big one.
Yeah.
Part of the challenge and the opportunity of this program, I think hopefully Ben agrees, is to challenge computer scientists and engineers and product managers to really think about what they mean when they use these terms that we use every day, like this isn't fair, or I would like this to be, yeah, we'll just stick with fairness because that one's easy. To really make them think what they mean by that, because we run the risk with these products of people using fairness so offhandedly that they haven't really reflected on the various different variables implicated by the goal. We don't want people to think of fairness as whatever happens to be useful or just feels only intuitively right to them. We want them to go through a process of winnowing down what their actual goals are as people and what their goals are as parts of a company and parts of a larger industry.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Going back to your research on just the recruitment process. You know, a company gets all these different resumes and AI is helping to sift through them. Obviously, we want an AI that's going to be, quote, fair, we all want a fair AI when it comes to hiring, but what does that actually mean? Like, what do we mean by that? And because it's simple for me to say, I'm not a philosopher. It's simple for me to say, oh, I want a diverse set of candidates. I want it to be fair. I want the best applicant to win. Like, it's easy for me to say that. But then, like, what's very complicated when it comes to AI and how it's like sorting through and trying to find the right candidate.
So
Chloe or Ben?
yeah,
Go,
well, so
Chloe.
one of the complications is that just as a person who might be faced with a lot of different resumes, just to stick with that example,
Yeah.
You might have a sense of what you want fairness to include, but it most likely includes a lot of things that might, a lot of principles that might be sort of mutually exclusive if you were entirely consistent in the way that you applied them. So you could think that you wanted fairness to include a concept of equal opportunity, that all candidates had, were only judged according to the relevant criteria for the job. So their age or sex or gender, for example, would be excluded in making a decision.
Mm-hmm.
But you might also think that in order to be fully fair, you should incorporate elements of equality of outcome or some kind of affirmative efforts to perhaps, account for some of the historical injustices that certain groups have faced that mean that they might not start at the exact same point as a group that did not have to, or members of a group that did not have to grapple with institutional discrimination. So you as a person might think all of that, and you might not need to be terribly reflective on it. But when we have AI, someone actually needs to program that in, which means that we need to make real decisions about how we want to balance those two principles, which might directly contradict. So I think that's the challenge that AI puts in front of us. It forces us to look at our own reasoning, our own decision making, which may not have always been terribly principled, and to make real choices, explicit ones, about how much we value different objectives.
A lot of the responsibility of being a professional or being a hiring manager or something is your own sort of trained intuition in particular situations. So if in this particular case you'd be faced with a CV from a person with particular attributes, you could use your own judgment to figure out what you think the fair thing to do is at that particular moment. You don't even need to have read 20 books on the philosophy of fairness to kind of understand what it is, what the best option for action is. Now, if you program that into an AI system or a predictive computer system, you are kind of asking the programmer to have thought of all the different situations that someone may find themselves in when they have to give feedback, when they make a decision about a person, which in itself is pretty much impossible, I would say, depending on the system that you're talking about. But in this particular case of hiring, it's not, you cannot think of every conceivable person who will apply to you with whatever conditions they may have, write exceptions and rules into the system. So it's also a bit much to ask of systems to be completely ethical and adhering to social standards. So that's what we're trying to show in these cases as well, is that the governance of these systems and how humans and these systems are interacting is also really important. Where you can't just impose the system on a professional, say a hiring manager or a judge or a policymaker or whoever. You can't give them a system and say, here you go, this is artificial intelligence, it's better than you, so just follow what predictions it comes with. That's the wrong way to think about these systems. And I think that's where what Chloe said earlier, this mystification of artificial intelligence as being superhuman is problematic. Humans do have a lot to say about how these systems are used, not only how they're designed, but also how they're used in practice. And that's something that we're trying to highlight here as well.
I'd just like to add one thing to what Ben said about systems not being ethical or something like that. I think the bigger issue is that a lot of the times what we want to say is that we want an AI system to be ethical, but that's sort of an impossibility because there's never any one such thing as being ethical. There's a lot of different ethical frameworks. There's a lot of different ways that you can prioritize values and manage trade-offs that would count as ethical, but there's no one right answer. There's going to have to be a plurality of ethics.
Yeah.
Can you, that's profound. Can you kind of maybe talk to that a little bit, kind of maybe give me a practical example?
Sure. So let me just think.
While Chloe thinks, I can just say a quick word, which may help. So what you see a lot at the moment in these debates about the governance of AI systems and internet technologies broadly is that people are calling for an ethical approach to AI, whatever that may mean. And a lot of people were calling for that for a series of years, the last few years. And I think there are still all these news articles and these situations happening where these systems mess up and cause huge issues, all sorts of harms. It could be dignitary, it could be harms to democracy even. And I think what people were calling for a few years ago was some kind of a super law that would, as long as we talk about it and as long as everyone agrees to be ethical, quote unquote, then everything will be fine. And what we're trying to show in this particular project is that ethics isn't law. Ethics isn't something that everyone should adhere to, and if they don't, they'll be heavily penalized. And therefore, as long as everyone stays close to the codes of ethics or ethical principles, then all the problems in the world are solved. That is not true. That's not what ethics is at all. And that is what we're trying to show here, that it's more of a deliberative process than a binary, just or unjust kind of situation.
Okay.
So I have an example.
Okay, good. Sorry to put you on the spot, Chloe.
No.
But this is like fascinating what you just said.
No, I just, so hopefully this is a good one. It's not very original, but so if you think of AI being used in terms of organ transplants, determining who gets what and prioritizing the order, to some degree, there are already these processes being used, at least in the West. Now, you could think of that technology using a utilitarian ethical framework, which is frequently just sort of the default ethical assumptions programmed into AI. But if you use that framework to evaluate it, and the technology is very good, meaning that more people are able to get matched with organs that they need and in the right order, such that fewer people die overall for lack of access to organs, then you could think, well, this is very ethical. This is good. You could also use a deontological framework, though, thinking that life and death decisions, ranking people in order for who's most worthy to get an organ or who's not, that is inherently not a decision that should be made by machines, that there's something so valuable about human life that it should be humans who have to make those decisions and who have to live with the emotional burdens of having done so. And in which case you might think that there's a problem using AI in that particular way. So depending which frame you're using to look at it, you could end up thinking that this is like a wonderful advancement for humanity, or you could think that it's sort of our demise. And you could use the same dual lenses to examine a lot of the AI technologies that are causing some of the most uproar. So organ transplants, but also autonomous weapons, for example, that from a utilitarian framework, well-designed systems might actually produce less human suffering, but there might just be something about life and death decisions that we don't want to outsource to machines. Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a really great example. And it makes me really happy when you say that, because the reason we started this collaboration at Princeton between the Center for IT Policy and the Center for Human Values, which is where the philosophers are based, is partly a reaction to some of the debates that were going on around ethical governance of AI systems, where typically, if these meetings are happening all over the world and you go to them and there are mostly lawyers in the room and a few engineers often as well, and people close the door and it's like, okay, let's talk about the ethics of this, and then everyone just brings their opinions to the table, but no one actually uses all the reasoning methodologies that have been developed in ethics for the last 2,000 years, or maybe even more. So it's, as Chloe was just explaining, there are these ways of thinking about problems and about tensions that are widely understood, and if you have a conversation based on looking through those lenses and based on the understanding of concepts, you raise the level of the conversation several levels higher than just talking about opinions and some technology that people think may or may not exist. And that's why this particular approach of building or using the tools that ethics has developed for us and applying it to technology is actually very useful. But the issue is it needs to be not misunderstood, if you understand the double negative there. So thanks for Chloe for highlighting that.
Oh, thank you for praising me for it.
Yeah, that's good. So I'm curious about, for the data scientists that are listening in to this conversation, what advice do you have for them as they're working on a project? Maybe it's not even advice. Maybe it's like questions they should be asking as they're developing things that they should be asking themselves, asking maybe their leaders, the business. Are there any things that you would suggest?
I have several. I'm sure Chloe does as well.
You first.
So I'll start this one with a little anecdote of a workshop, something that happened in a workshop I once organized with internet engineers who had been building the internet for the last few decades and who were still involved in making the big decisions about how the system works. And they were doing experiments on internet networks. Just to figure out how information flows, what the internet actually looks like, which decisions need to be made to make sure that it runs smoothly. And people were talking about doing or having run into issues when they were doing experiments in places like Peru or Western China or places they'd never been to themselves. But they were running into all these issues where they had collected data about people and that got leaked out, and that actually had hurt people, or there was a potential for that information being used against them. And they were talking about like how they did not understand how to predict ethical issues in different cultures. Where they asked me whether they had to learn Confucianism or all sorts of other frameworks to understand how that would work. And then I asked them, do you not ever call someone in those countries before you start doing experimentation there and before you start collecting data and maybe even changing the technology and therefore the environment that their informational environment? And the engineers laughed and they said, Ben, the reason we invented the internet was because we didn't want to speak to people, which very much also applies to data scientists and people developing AI systems. Is the awareness that your data points are actual humans and that the predictions that you are making about them will actually impact them, and you not having a clue who they are, or maybe you thinking that everyone's more or less like you, which in a lot of cases is not the whole world is a white dude with a good education. If that's how you think, or if you don't understand who these people actually are and what the programming you do how that impacts people, then you really need to get out there and spend some time speaking to people properly and showing them what kind of data you're collecting, showing them what kind of decisions these systems will be making about them. And that includes also people working as contractors for governments. Governments, they are supposed to be checked by things like Congress and parliaments. But to be honest, hardly anyone in those parliaments understands what these technologies are. So it's really difficult for them to check what the contracted programmers are doing for certain government agencies. So there is a responsibility for these programmers to, even if it's not within the scope of your work, put it in the scope of your work and make sure you really understand in depth what the impact is on the humans whose data you're using for your systems. And so the work that Chloe and I have been setting up here at Princeton is, I think, really useful for that, to begin to get an understanding of what kind of questions should we be asking and how should we even be thinking about the things, the responses we're getting, and how should we even start to think about the tensions that develop as we're speaking to people and the governments or whoever else may be asking to build these systems. It's not enough to sit in whichever comfortable office and develop a system and ship it off and be happy, because more likely than not, it's going to have a negative impact on people. Even if it's a small amount of people, it's still worth, or you have a responsibility. It's not just worth it. You have a responsibility to know what the impact is.
I would just add two main things to that. First, definitely people need to be worried about the potential negative impacts of even small, low-level engineering decisions. All of that matters. And also, just to add a positive spin to it, they should be thinking about ways that technology can make the world better. It's not only protecting against their decisions having negative effects, but I think a lot of people get into computer science or get into engineering because they think that they're going to have a positive impact. And so, you're more likely to be able to do that if you've really thought through the design and the deployment decisions surrounding the technology you want to be working on. So I guess I'd also just want to, add a little positive spin there. It's not just about doing damage control. It can potentially be these really positive tools. And then I think I'd also just want people to know that regardless of where you stand, whether you're an entry-level programmer or whether you're the CEO of one of these huge companies, that your decisions are never really value neutral when it comes to AI. Even saying that you don't want to make any sort of ethical decisions ends up having ethical impacts. So we're all implicated at each level. You can't actually shirk the responsibility. And then once you accept that, and I think that people need to accept that, then you should start thinking about making better decisions, or at least thoughtful ones. Even efficiency is a value. Even programming for accuracy, that's an acknowledgement of a certain set of values, and it leads you down a particular path. And maybe that's the one that you want to go down. Maybe that's what you really do want to prioritize, which would make perfect sense. But know what you lose by choosing particular trade-offs. Know what you lose by balancing one goal over another, and be willing to defend that.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Ben?
I think that's really where the value of ethics comes in, is what Chloe was saying at the end there, is oftentimes, there won't be a right or a perfect answer, or there'll be several right answers, or there'll be a least wrong answer, or whatever. But ethics gives you the tools to show you, or to show the people you're in discussion with, how you are thinking about certain trade-offs and how you are prioritizing certain things above others. And as Chloe said there, accuracy and efficiency are oftentimes things that come back in discussions we have. But that is, I think, this is my opinion, but I think it's because in computer science degrees or courses, people, and mathematics as well, it's the most efficient and elegant solution to a problem that is the right answer or the winning answer. So the value of efficiency and accuracy is elevated above others without thinking through what that means for the other value tensions. And you have at companies, especially, profit is the main value. Companies are responsible to their shareholders to maximize profit. So obviously that's going to be one of your main values, but you need to be aware that that is actually a value that you're optimizing for. You can also use all sorts of different proxies as profit making. I won't name them now, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Things like connectivity and stuff. But it's important to understand that those values are in tension with others, and they can be changed. They don't need to take priority over other values. And a final thing I'd like to say there is about the current discussions on technology for social good. There have been many conferences in recent years with subtitles such as Solve for Good or AI for Social Good. And everyone goes there feeling wonderful about all these examples that are displayed. But the issue is that hardly anyone, I'd like to even say almost no one asks at these conferences is, what do we mean by good? When is something not social good? At which point it's because these things aren't obvious, because good is a very subjective thing. But then the question you need to ask is, good for whom? And then also, who's that bad for? And there seems to be this, I don't want to call it whitewashing, but it's this, too naive sort of positive feeling about let's all work towards the social good without having any understanding what that is. And if you look at any political process, getting to an understanding of social good is really hard. So you can't just get on a stage and say, let's also solve for social good, and then everyone runs off and makes the world a better place. That's super naive. But it does seem to be the direction that a lot of data science and AI engineering is going into.
Yeah, I think that there's a real difference between solving for good based on whatever you happen to think good is, and trudging forward as a Pollyanna, and acknowledging that there are competing definitions of the good, and that just because you want to do something good doesn't mean it will necessarily end up in that direction. I mean, a lot of our cases deal with technologies that were actually meant to do good. There are no bad actors in our cases. Everyone's trying to do at least not the wrong thing, and some people are trying to do the right thing. And one of the interesting things about the cases is you see how even actors trying to do a good thing can end up in a place that's morally questionable. So I don't mean to say that I think engineers should be, just running full forward with what they think the social good is, but I do think that it's important not to think of their work as just always trying to avoid negative, that there can be an empowering aspect to it too. I think that's all I would try to add. Yeah.
Yeah, I love this. I love chatting with you both. I think we need more ethicists, we need more philosophers, more lawyers at these conferences around AI, because we need to hear your voices, your concerns, and like what you're getting at, even at conferences called AI for Good, like having discussions, like you're saying, about what exactly do you mean by good, and good for who, and who could that be bad for? Like, what are all the implications of that? I think that, I think this is just a call to have more discussions at these conferences, and bringing other experts, philosophers, ethicists, legal minds in to these conversations. We need more than just coders and people who are brilliant in data science. We need other experts, and I know that just from these data talks, from talking to other data science leaders, like they want that too. Like they know that we need these other experts to come in to share their thoughts and concerns and to make these products better. So I'm really glad that we could chat today. As we were chatting, I was thinking, when I'm at work, every year I have to go through IT security training. I have all these different trainings I have to do here at work. And I was just thinking, we need some sort of like data ethics training, like on a yearly basis, that needs to happen for all employees around the data that we're handling, so that we're thinking about the questions that you guys are raising. Like I think there's a strong need for that as businesses are handling more data. So it's great to see the case studies you guys are building at Princeton, raising really good questions, doing a lot of great work in this field, and just want to thank you guys for that, and also for people who are interested in getting involved to learn more about the work you guys are doing. Ben or Chloe, where should people go?
Our website is the best place. Our email addresses are up there.
Okay.
Our emails are under the contact. The case studies section has 6 of our now publicly available, free for use case studies for people who might be interested in teaching these topics either in a traditional educational environment or within companies, or even just people who are interested in reading them and learning a little bit more. And you can always reach us through email.
Okay, wonderful. And again, the short URL to get over to the microsite on princeton.edu, the short URL is just ex.pn/Princeton, and that'll bring you over to the page where you can see all the various case studies and how to contact Ben and Chloe. Ben and Chloe, thank you so much for being part of today's Data Talk. I learned a lot. It's awesome to hear all the work you guys are doing, and hopefully we can touch base again in the near future.
That'd be great.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.